Okay, so Jason Verbelli is an independent investigator and researcher of unconventional technologies. Since 2006, he's dedicated himself to experimenting with exotic phenomena, both electric and magnetic. He moved from the San Francisco Bay Area to San Diego in 2013 to fully commit himself to studying and applying the concept of magnetic waveforms. He's been an integral part of developing unique magnetic materials and helps educate the public to bring these revolutionary concepts to the mainstream. His passion and enthusiasm is paving the way for the next generation to better understand this emerging branch of science. Jason wears a lot of hats in his day-to-day role, which includes lab tech, media and public relations, operations manager, and president of SEG Magnetics. So Jason, among many other things, has been very, very, very involved with the Searle effect and you know what that team is doing. And actually, he joined us today to talk about the work of Edward Dowdye. I may not be pronouncing that right, but let me hand it over to Jason. Sir, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. I already feel at home. See some familiar faces. For those who don't know me, my name is Jason Verbelli, and I am associated with SEG Magnetics and Professor John Searle's work. Unbeknownst to many other people, I am quite involved in validating the claims of many other suppressed researchers, namely who I will be talking about today, Dr. Edward Dowdye. So hope to deliver some new ideas and very much appreciate you giving me a platform to rant my heretical diatribes. So I'm sure some people are sick of my Facebook posts and other posts on the internet making outlandish claims. So it's time to match some extraordinary evidence with these extraordinary claims.
Sorry about that. I hit the wrong button. Jason, let me ask you to unmute. I was trying to mute myself. Let me ask you to unmute again.
There we go.
Yeah, I would say, yeah, go ahead. If you're ready to get started with your presentation, go for it. And
now, how do I?
Oh, so there's a green screen share button down on the bottom. So if you click that.
See if I can do the PowerPoint presentation here.
There you go.
Yeah,
looks great. And then I think you know how to do the full screen if you want to do that, right?
Let's see if I can do that here.
And Zoom is going to show you like along the side of the presentation. So we will also be able to see you present.
Great.
Awesome. So what I'm going to do is then I'll just mute myself back out, and I will be here the whole time, but I will hide in the background while you present, sir.
Thank you so much. All right. Again, my name is Jason Verbelli, and the title of this presentation is The Rebirth of Classic Physics, Time, Light, and Gravity. This is based upon Galilean transformations and the work of Dr. Edward Dowdye. So first, I wanted to try to get back to some of the basics. Language, semantics, and terminology matter, and we mustn't lose our way in science or confuse the meanings of the following terms. I take proof as meaning a mathematical derivation to show how you arrived at the solution to an equation. So proof is simply a route to show how you got a mathematical answer. Evidence is information and data collected through experiment and observation. Proof and evidence are not the same thing, but people use those terms as transitory when they shouldn't. So a hypothesis is a hypothetical scenario that is proposed, but a theory is an explanation of that hypothetical scenario, but based within specific constraints and a mathematical framework and consequences of a given model. So experiments and observations never prove a theory. Experiments do not provide math. Experiments provide evidence, and math is written to describe that evidence after it is gathered. So you can only disprove a theory or an explanation through observation and experiments. Experiments, again, gather evidence to suggest that an understanding is correct until new evidence is gathered to contradict that previous understanding. So math is a language and a tool, but it can be deviously misused as wile. So this is the difference between science and science. One of them is trying to determine the world around us, and the other one is just messing with your mind. So you can derive equations for any given hypothetical scenario, but not all scenarios exist in nature, and some of them are just computer simulations that might not be accurate to nature, and some of those scenarios conflict. So people normally think of math as an end-all, be-all validation for an argument. If an equation can be written for in a scenario, that scenario must be accurate, right? Well, not necessarily. Specific examples I'll give later with math equations that are contradictory to describe the same scenario. But the mathematical proofs derived from Galilean transformations happens to be in direct opposition to relativity. Relativity is based under Lorentz transformations and must abide by the proofs and constraints provided by the math of that particular model, which dictate that mass increases with velocity, that gravity is not a force, that time dilates, and that the velocity of light remain the same in all frames of reference, a constancy. But this following presentation sheds light on alternatives from the opposing framework. And this credible opposing framework comes from Dr. Edward Dowdye and is named effectivity, a contradictory to relativity. And under this emissions theory, mass does not increase with velocity. Gravity is a force and an emission. Time is constant to everyone and does not dilate, even though it's an illusion. The velocity of light is dependent upon the velocity of the light source. There is no requirement for a constancy of electromagnetic radiation in all frames of reference. Even Maxwell's equations, there's nothing wrong with the equations other than the assumption that they require a constancy in all frames. So there is no requirement for any media to propagate light or generate a gravitational effect under this particular theory. And there's no fourth dimension and no ether. So there's no deforming media at all, whether it be 3D or 4D. And on the right, you can see some more details, and I'll be giving more diagrams and references throughout. So the way I look at relativity, I'll give an analogy of a toothpick bridge. So Einstein very cleverly built a bridge to the solution of the perihelion of Mercury to the binary pulsar PSR 1913 and 16, and quite a few other solutions that no other method was able to yield for over 100 years until 1991 with the work of Dr. Edward Dowdye. So although it's clever, it's not exactly the right approach, and it's an artifice. And the bridge has too many holes in it, and it's collapsing under its own weight, while the scientific community continues to walk in lockstep across the bridge. And what I have found is that relativity model has cherry-picked different aspects of classic physics and mutually exclusive models to try to hold it together, to try to save face and use those other models as glue. But as an analogy, there is an airport now on either side of the Grand Canyon with a structurally sound conveyor belt, but people still use this toothpick bridge, and it works until it doesn't. So why should we listen to this? I mean, who is this information coming from? Well, this is Dr. Edward Dowdye, and his website is extinctionshift.com. And unfortunately, he passed away New Year's Eve of 2020. So since he isn't here to deliver the information, I'll try to do it justice in his stead. He earned multiple degrees from Hampton University in mathematics, electronics technology, and physics. He earned a diploma in atomic physics from Heidelberg with a concentration of nuclear magnetic resonance on atoms and ions in confined plasma vessels with a support from the German Academic Exchange. He studied astronomy and astrophysics at Heidelberg, earned his PhD in laser spectroscopy physics from Howard University in Washington, D.C., and also was an electrical engineer and retired from NASA, and also studied with the Center for the Study of the Terrestrial and Extraterrestrial Atmospheres. He's also responsible for mapping the polar ice caps and the atmosphere of Venus and building many satellites that NASA has used to document gravitational alleged lensing and a bunch of other very credible projects. He taught physics and mathematics at many universities, Lincoln, Cheney, Marymount, Southeastern, and Howard universities, as well as instructing atomic physics students in Germany. He was fluent in German, English, Spanish, and had an academic knowledge of French. He was also a member of the American Physical Society and what is also known as the Center for the Study of Photonics and Energy. And he was also a member of the internationally other recognized scientific organizations. He was well loved in the scientific community, and he has many peer reviews and corroborating documents. So this guy is the real deal and everything that a skeptic could ask for. And I'll be listing more of his citations and references at the end. So to give some history and comparisons, why should we question relativity and the use of Lorentz transformations? It's worked for over 100 years, but it's the scientific community's duty to scrutinize a model with such volumes of material and mathematical justification and observational and experimental evidence, and a simpler method of yielding the same predictions and conclusions. I think William Ockham would be proud. And even Einstein himself said that if another method and approach were able to yield the same predictions and solutions, that relativity would eventually collapse and would not be needed. So the importance of Dowdy's emissions theory really cannot be understated and must be taken into serious consideration. His unparalleled qualifications and scientific contributions and international recognition have earned him the right to be heard. There's so much politics in science now. It's created an idiocracy of doublethink, where people now accept ideas that are mutually exclusive to reality. And the newcomers to this particular emissions theory must be reminded that we got to put aside all, not just a few ideas. Got to get rid of space-time, time dilation, and all extraneous requirements, and take a look at everything we've seen before with fresh eyes and under a new light, pardon the pun. Explain that later. So we're going to go back to where we were before Poincaré and before Einstein and before 1913. And this is the difference between relativity and classic physics. Just some listings here. And for people who are familiar with relativity, might make them cringe and irk at some of the blasphemous claims that are listed here, like gravity is instantaneous between bodies, when some people in relativity say it propagates at the rate of c. But that, again, is a cherry-picked aspect of classic physics. So in relativity, light speed is a limit and a constant. Space and time are linked. Time is a location in 3D space. Light follows the curvature of space-time. The curvature of space-time itself is equal to gravity. Gravity is not a force. And 3D mass displaces a 4D media. And they treat the fourth dimension itself as a physical deforming media. And they say time itself is the fourth dimension. Velocity is proportional to time. The faster you go, the slower time gets. And that reality itself is linked to time. So the faster you go, the slower you experience reality subjectively. And that time is different to everybody. And reality is different to everybody. And everybody has their own frame of reference. But under classic physics, the constant of c is just a constant, is not a limit. There is no light speed limit. You can travel billions of times faster than light. There's space, and then there is time. Time is absolute, as Newton suggested. There is no space-time, but rather it's real time as we experience. There's only one reality. Light refracts rather than bends around the curvature of space, and I'll get into that later. Gravity is a force, and it propagates just like light at the rate of c. And there is only 3D Euclidean space, x, y, and z axis. No need for fourth dimension, which the fourth dimension itself was really invented as a replacement for the 3D luminiferous ether that was dismantled by Michelson-Morley around 1906. So to try to save face, Einstein just literally invented the fourth orthogonal axis where we can abandon all thermodynamics and logic and physics conveniently. So none of that in classic physics. We abide by Euclid and Pythagoras, and time does not dilate. It's the same from all frames of reference, and we are all experiencing the same reality together. There is no universal now in relativity, but there is only now universally in classic physics. So this is a completely different approach, and there has not been a more beneficial reformulation of science, math, and physics like this since Isaac Newton, Robert Hooke, Christian Huygens, or Nicholas Fatio. Even Wolfgang Pauli and Walther Ritz fall short in comparison to Dr. Dowdye. And I know that is a fantastic claim, but let's go through this and see if other people agree. But in order to first talk about gravity, we have to talk about light, since they operate the same under this particular theory. And rather than the Newtonian model with the prism, which is erroneous, this follows more along with Johann Goethe and refraction at the meniscus or boundary of a solar body rather than space curvature around a body. And this deals with time is the same to everyone rather than time is different in different frames of reference. Some of these things I want to quickly go through later on so that you just have the material to look at later and review the material again. So reflection technically does not exist. The same light does not ricochet. What you see here is an alternative to the invariance of the wave equation under Galiliean transformations. And what this means is that all the light you ever observe is the re-emitted light from the electrons making up yourself. Electrons absorb and emit. All matter is made of electrons. All matter is made of atoms, and all atoms have electrons. So an incoming light or an incoming primary is absorbed by the electrons of yourself, a detector, or any observer or any media. That incoming primary is diminishes to zero, and a secondary crescendos as an equal and opposite reaction. And that happens at the rate of c, serving the illusion that it's the same light passing through a media and continuing on distorted. No wave packet can ever distort under this particular framework. A primary is incoming, absorbed, ceases to exist, and a secondary is re-emitted from a new frame of reference. And every re-emission is a new frame of reference. So another example, it's not the same light coming through your window. The sunlight comes and then hits the atoms making up the glass. The electrons absorb that, diminishes to zero, and a secondary is re-emitted into your room, serving the illusion that the same light just passed through. And this is the most important part of the equation, I think, which says that the velocity of this wavelength in another frame of reference will always be viewed as c, no matter what, from anybody's frame of reference, which is the illusion why Einstein thought that the velocity of light is the same in all frames of reference. Because since the electrons making up all observers and all detectors are traveling relative with that observer, all observers can only see the re-emitted light from the electrons making up themselves, which is traveling relative to themselves. Therefore, they measure the velocity as c always, even if that incoming primary light is faster or slower due to the source approaching or receding away from the observer. So no matter what, all observers find the velocity of the wave to always be c, but that's only apparent, and it's relative to each observer's point of view from their most primary source, which is ultimately the electrons making up themselves. So if you have a flashlight pointing at a mirror, light does not ricochet and just bounce off of the glass. You have the primary emitter as the flashlight, and then the light is absorbed by the glass, re-emitted into the eye, and then you observe that secondary re-emission. But if we zoom into the atoms making up the eye itself, we would note that the electrons making up the cornea absorb that secondary and then simultaneously reproduce a tertiary and a third wave, which then goes into your eye and then is absorbed. And then it happens atom by atom. So you never observe or measure the initial primary light, and it is impossible to measure the velocity of any primary for any observer. And it's an equal and opposite reaction for every secondary packet. And the main point of relativity and all other previous models is that light comes in, the same light is distorted and continues on. This says that it's a different light at every given point, and there are major consequences for that. So again, the analogy of the two balloons, one of them diminishes, the other crescendos. One packet diminishes, the other crescendos. So the illusion is that all detectors and observers see the re-emitted light from themselves. So imagine if you're encased in glass and you can only measure the refractive index of the surrounding media. There's no way for you to tell the velocity or any light outside of that media. But the electrons making up yourself are that media. So it's impossible to see. All observers only measure the frequency of interference between the sources. And if you were able to have no electrons and see that packet go through you, you would see that the packet is traveling the speed of light plus the speed of the source to or from an observer. And even Einstein himself said that if the velocity of light is even a tiny bit dependent upon the velocity of the light source, then my entire theory of relativity and gravitation is false. So photons are not particles. And in this particular theory, there is no particle wave duality. It is an illusion, even with the double slit, because the slits themselves are made of atoms which have electrons. Part of the primary makes it through the slits, but the boundary of the slits themselves absorb that primary and re-emit a secondary, which is superimposed on top of the primary. So now you have multiple wave packets. And if you place a detector in that, the detector will affect that from the mere electrons making up itself, serving the illusion that it's the observation that is due to the collapse of the wave packet, when really it's the mere presence of the atoms is due to the re-emission of a wave packet. So light does not behave like bullets, but if you were to shoot a bullet in microgravity, you could trace that path, that straight-lined rectilinear path of the bullet. So that is likened to a wave packet propagating from a source, and you can trace that packet of the boundary, and it travels in a straight line from any frame of reference. And light, if it ever seems to travel in a curve, it is a re-emission, because light can never be bent, never can be made. It can never deviate from its rectilinear path. So if you have a flashlight approaching a mirror, then the light approaching that mirror will be one speed, one velocity, but then by the time it is absorbed by the mirror and re-emitted to your eye, it again is traveling at c. So no matter what, no matter how fast or slow approaching a receding source, it will always be viewed at the rate of c. So if, let's see what else we got here. Re-emission propagation. So if we have the primary traveling towards, you have to account for the speed and the velocity of the source in addition to the velocity of light. So let's see if we can go to the next one here. So imagine a person on a train shooting a bullet towards a target. The target is 1 light minute away. So if you shoot that gun, the bullet will take 1 minute to get to the target. Travels in a straight line. And it's traveling at the speed of light relative to the gun. So he shoots from the gun, speed of light. But if you're on a train approaching the target, now you have to account for the speed of light plus the speed that you're traveling towards the target. So if you're traveling half the speed of light towards a target, then you shoot the bullet, it's going to reach the target in 30 seconds. So if you're holding a laser pointer and you're traveling at half the speed of light towards a target, and you push that button 1 light minute away, the light from that particular laser pointer will arrive in 30 seconds because you're already traveling half the speed of light, and that light is always traveling relative to the source. And the same applies to, let's see if I can play this. And the same applies to the spherical boundary of a photon or any electromagnetic radiation, which propagates as an expanding sphere from the source. So the center of the source itself can be traveling in any given direction, but the emissions coming from that source will always be traveling and propagating relative to the source. So there's not going to be a compression on one side, even if the source is accelerating. It's always going to travel relative to that initial source. And that applies to gravity as well. So now, all of the light that you ever see is the re-emitted light from the electrons making up yourself. Likewise, all of the gravity that you experience is the re-emitted gravity from the electrons making up yourself. So electrostatic attraction and repulsion, magnetic attraction and repulsion, eddy currents, centrifugal force, Casimir force, and acceleration all simulate the effects of gravity, but none of those things are gravity. And I put this detailed article together on steemit.com to show a bunch of different models of gravity and validations for each. But I have a favorite, which happens to be Dr. Edward Dowdye's. And here you can see some equations, which we'll go over later. And also, if you want to visit my YouTube channel at The Real Verbs, I have these two videos, which go into a lot more detail of everything that I'm going to talk about today. Classic physics versus relativity, the history and alternatives, and also the concept of gravity under classic physics versus relativity. Just a rhetorical question. Do you think gravity is instantaneous? If you do, then gravity is not a force. Gravity is the simultaneous displacement of a media, and that subscribes to relativity and ether theories. Like if you sit in a bathtub full of water and the water level rises simultaneously as you sit in the water, your 3D mass is displacing that media. So everywhere within that tub, the water level will rise in proportion to the amount of volume of media you are displacing. The fourth dimension itself is treated as a physical media. So a 3D mass will displace a fourth dimensional media, and that happens on demand, in real time, simultaneously. And if you think gravity is not instantaneous, and it's a force, and if it's a force, it can have a delay between different points depending on how far they are away from each other. If the velocity of light, if light takes a certain amount of time to get between 2 points, then so does gravity. Everything light does, gravity does as well under this particular framework. So the gravity is a delayed emission with no requirement for any media. And that's under classic physics and Galiliean transformations. But this is different than previous interpretations of classic physics, which assumed an ether media distorts or something deforms or dark matter or some media, but none of that is needed after these reformulations. And I wasn't sure if the video files would work during this presentation. So this is just for reference for the next 4-minute video that I want to show regarding this concept of the difference between what Benjamin was talking about in the last talk regarding virtual particles, which don't exist, but can be treated like an as if. So the math for them can be written and formulated, even though it might not exist in reality. It's an as if.
Just taking a break from some machining, but relativity says that there is space-time and space-time is flat with no mass present. There's mass present, space-time curves. The curvature of space-time is equal to gravity. Light bends around the curvature of space-time. And if there is an explosion of that body, that space-time would just boom, go flat instantly, if not have some sort of a little rebound or a recoil. That's not real though. So the claim for general relativity is that gravity gets cut off in real time, instantaneous. Explosion here, instantaneous recoil of the space-time curvature back to flat again, which means all of the planets orbiting around the sun, if that sun exploded, according to the general relativity, all the planets would immediately go flying off into space, yet the planets would still observe the sun in the location, spinning around, looping in the sky just fine. That doesn't really make sense. So classic physics says there is no space-time, that time is the same from all frames of reference. Reality is linked to time. You can't change reality or the perspective of time, even through the cosmos from all frames of reference. We are already orbiting a barycenter. We're already offset. So the Earth is not orbiting exactly the center of the sun. It's orbiting 20 0.5 arc seconds off. So the sun is actually, the Earth is orbiting the sun where it was 8.33 minutes ago. So there is an offset and delay of the signals propagating from the sun to the planets. And there's a delay from the gravity propagating from the sun to the planets. And if the sun exploded, we would all see the explosion happen in real time, but we wouldn't feel its effects, and that shock wave wouldn't reach us for 8.33 minutes. Not that the sun would explode, space-time curvature would flatten, and then everything would fly away instantly. No, it would take time for that wave of destruction to propagate out at the speed of light. And that would take 8.33 minutes from here. But if that happened at the center of our galaxy, it would take 13,000 light years for that wave of destruction to happen. And if that active galactic nuclei is still there, then we just continue orbiting. And if it isn't there, then we'd continue orbiting as if it was already there until that wave of destruction reaches us. So that's kind of what that says. So rather than say there is some black hole at the center of a galaxy bending the curvature of space-time and attracting all of the mass to the center, maybe we should say that there used to be a central star at the center of a galaxy. If you are seeing stars orbiting nothing, that event exploded long ago, yet the stars are still orbiting that galactic barycenter, and that wave of destruction has not propagated to that portion of the galaxy. So no need for fourth dimensions and fabrics of space or black holes, just 3D Euclidean space, the rules of Pythagoras, X, Y, and Z, here and now, to everyone.
Okay, so relativity says that we are looking back in time at the moon 1.25 seconds, that we are looking back in time at the sun 8.33 minutes, and when we see a galaxy 1 million light years away, they say we are looking 1 million light years in the past at the galaxy. But according to this model, that is not accurate. Everything that we are seeing is happening in real time right now, even though it takes signals, a delay to reach us. So the signals that we are receiving now might be very ancient and not associated with what we are looking at right now, because what we are looking at is happening in real time, but the signals that we are receiving could be millions of years ago. And they think that what they are hearing is what they are associated with what they are seeing now, but that might not necessarily be accurate. So what is the shape of sound, of light, of gravity, and electromagnetic radiation? Well, I like John Stuart Reid's model, and John Stuart Reid is quite famous for his work in cymatics. And he has a sound bubble wave model, which also happens to correlate with light and gravity and electromagnetic radiation. So all of these things propagate as expanding spheres, except sound requires a medium to travel, which travels about 720 miles an hour, depending on the conditions. Einstein couldn't tell you that, right? He asked Einstein the speed of sound, he'll tell you he doesn't keep such information in his mind that you could readily look into books. It's kind of a cop-out to me. He knew the speed of light, right? So Galiliean transformations do not require any media for electromagnetic radiation to propagate, and that is only under Lorentz. So sound, light, gravity, electromagnetic radiation propagates according to Huygens principle as expanding spheres. But it's a media that buckles and waves in response to a constant stimulus, like how stars don't twinkle. It's the atmosphere refracting in convection, serving the illusion of a twinkle. So a source might not necessarily be a wave, but by the time you measure it, it produces a wave-like response. And as a visual, I want to show people this little video here. So this deals with spherical wave fronts because everything propagates as an expanding sphere, but concave wave ends. So what you're seeing here is an image of an out of control rocket moving away from the camera with the back end of the rocket facing the camera while corkscrewing and wobbling. So if you light a cigarette and you trace a circle in the air with the cigarette, it'll trace a circle. Now walk forward at a constant rate while tracing the circle, and the trail of smoke will form a corkscrew. The smoke is ionized and illuminated by the rocket's thruster. But if you notice that black sphere expanding and seem to expand from the extinguished source, that's just the night sky being exposed. But the emissions cease from the source, and that's the point. You're seeing the boundary and the concave wave end expand away from the source. So if you were to have a constant emission like a light from a light bulb, and then you were to cut that light bulb off, that sphere of influence would just end, and there would be a concave wave end to that emission. So if you play a speaker in a canyon and you destroy the speaker, the sound that already left that speaker will continue to propagate out, even though the source is extinguished. And the same applies to the light and gravity that leaves a star. Even though a star could explode or be long gone, the emissions that already left will continue to propagate out with the delay. So Mercury would orbit where the sun used to be if the sun exploded, and it would orbit for about 3.2 minutes until that back end of the wave packet ceased and that emissions of gravity would no longer be there, so the planets would be screwed up. But if the sun exploded, Venus would still orbit where the sun used to be for 6 minutes, and Earth would orbit where the sun used to be for 8.33 minutes. So if our center of the galaxy exploded, again, it would take quite some time before our orbit was disturbed, and it would seem like there was some mysterious force keeping the galaxy together, when really it's just the emissions that have already left that are continuing to influence. So that concave wave end is just for a visual so that you can get a understanding of the shape of the wave packets when they are on and then when they cease. That's if it gets cut off right away. So let's go to the next one. So now we can talk a little bit more about gravity. But when you talk about gravity with people, what specifically do you mean? It's known what gravity does. No one denies that when you jump up, you indeed come back down, but it's the mechanism that's not understood. Isaac Newton never claimed to have a theory for the cause of gravity, but rather he developed the mathematical proofs to describe the behavior and matter and energy within a gravitational field and potential gradient. He said, I have not as yet been able to discover the reason for these properties of gravity from phenomena, and I do not form any hypothesis. Now, Einstein said gravity is not a force and defined gravity as the curvature of space-time itself, the deformation of a fourth-dimensional media that is treated like condensed matter. But no matter where you are and no matter where you measure, they say that that manifold behaves like the meniscus of the boundary between a physical fluid, again, trying to grasp aspects of classic physics and reality to use as glue. So there is no pull or attraction in relativity. So it's inappropriate for supporters of relativity to use phrases like gravitational force or model any pull. The curvature in a hill doesn't pull a ball down. There is no force or any work being exerted. Gravity is the displacement of a media according to relativity. Again, like sitting in a bathtub and the water simultaneously and instantly reacts, not propagating at the rate of c. If something is propagating, that is a force, and forces propagate. Even with the claim of LIGO and the gravitational waves, that's still inappropriate because in order to generate a capillary wave or de Broglie wave, it requires an impact of condensed matter against condensed matter on a real physical surface. But again, the fourth dimensional manifold is treated as a media, not like a meniscus. And there is no impact of the fourth dimension. So you can't unite these mutually exclusive ideas to try to save face. Now, Casimir force of ultrafine particles by Nicholas Fatio and Georges Lesage was addressed very well by Gareth of See the Pattern in this video that you can look up on YouTube. I like this particular video that he put together, and the Casimir force, I'm sure the people listening, deals with the cancellation of frequencies and wavelengths between plates. So there is more pressure on the outside of the plate. So therefore the plates are pushed together from the outside in. Not that there is an infinite accumulation of dark matter in between the plates, pulling them together with an infinite amount of energy and infinite amount of space curvature. No, it's just pushing from the outside. But you can mathematically interpret it as pulling from the inside, and you can write all of these extraneous equations to satisfy that solution, even though it's not real. You can always develop math to describe the opposite scenario, but don't get caught up in the as if and then use it as a literal. That's where I think the scientific community has lost its way. Two other very important researchers in gravity are Walter C. Wright with his push gravity model, example of his book, and one of my favorites, Dr. Eugene Podkletnov and his rotating superconductors. And he also happened to be fond of Professor John Searle's work. So he has an interpretation that these experiments do not violate relativity because you cannot violate what does not apply. Now, a lot of people like to mention Walter Russell, and he had a lot of esoteric interpretations to these things. But I think one point that is valid is his statement that light does not travel and it's reproduced from wave field to wave field. He said that light and heat doesn't flow from one point of space to another. Same for electricity and magnetism. It's not a flow, but rather a reproduction. But I think that is a little too esoteric, and we can dispel that by saying light does propagate, but it is not the same light that propagates between sources, and it is re-emitted from media to media rather than reproduced from wave field to wave field. So there is valid sound cause to listen to Walter Russell's work, a lot of it. He had some beautiful things to say. So this particular theory deals with photons and gravitons as a wave packet. A light is photons, but a photon is not a ball particle. It's a wave packet, which is a massless spherical emission, expanding at the rate of c according to Huygens principle. And gravity is gravitons. A graviton is a wave packet, not a particle. It is a massless spherical emission expanding at the rate of c according to Huygens principle. A particle is what something is, not what something does, and a wave is what something does, not what something is. And there is no particle wave duality, and there is no literal mass to energy interchange. There is an equivalence. So matter can absorb, retain, and impart energy, but no amount of shock waves will intersect to produce a particle, and no amount of particles will extinguish to become energy. They will be pulverized into shrapnel and fragmented until they are reduced to smaller and smaller particles, exerting energy and dissipating, but that mass does not become energy unto itself, and there is no literal interchange. When a crystal forms and grows, it's taking the building blocks from the solution around it to convert to more matter. And when a plant absorbs energy through photosynthesis, the light gives energy to the leaves, which then send the information to the roots to absorb the nutrients from the soil. So the light doesn't actually become mass. It just gives the energy to the plant to extract from the surrounding environment. There is no energy in matter other than what is received from the environment. And that is by Nikola Tesla. Okay. So the gravitational spectrum, gravity has a spectrum under this theory, like light. A primary gravity can be absorbed and a secondary gravity re-emitted like a reflection or an echo. Gravity has wavelengths and frequencies and propagates like light at the rate of c. Gravity can have a delay and be offset and have an aberration effect. like how we don't exactly orbit the exact center of the sun. We are offset to it ever so slightly by 8.33 minutes. And gravity can be focused like a spotlight or even a laser. Gravity is a force. That's the main point. All the light you ever see is the re-emitted light from the electrons making up yourself. All the gravity you experience is the re-emitted gravity from the electrons making up yourself. So you don't have to worry about the gravity of the earth, the sun, or the weight of the world. You ultimately only need to worry about yourself. What if Atlas's mother had told him that, huh? Let's see. So here are a couple diagrams from Dr. Edward Dowdye dealing with Euclidean space and electrodynamics and gravitation under 3D Euclidean space geometry. And there are, I have links that I will share with others later on, when sources for all of this stuff. And here he has more detailed information as to the transfer of the gravity, which can be interpreted as information. It's not literal information like Morse code or a transmission. And here he deals with the aberration effect of gravity. Now, because we are offset to the sun, the emissions that leave the sun right now will reach us in 8.33 minutes. So all of the gravity that we are experiencing is delayed. And that delay you can determine with simple math. And you don't need any extraneous metric tensors and a lot of hard extra math that we just don't need. And if we want to use the simple solution to get to the right answer, this might be a better approach. So again, this is just a visual example. Do not be fooled by the animation of the particles raining down overhead. Photons and gravitons are not particles, but this is just to denote that spherical wave packet, that straight line path from the source. So it should really show like hemispheres growing towards the ground, but I'd like to have people help me with graphic design later so that we can turn these into more professional diagrams in motion. But we should take note that the Earth itself is a moving laboratory, and we're all traveling at a tangent to these incoming energies already. So we're all experiencing gravity on all sides of the Earth, on all planets, at a relatively constant rate, given the delay and aberration of the gravity that we are all rotating, orbiting, and cutting through, I guess we could say. So this is only using classical approaches under Galiliean transformations, and we can yield the equivalent solutions to relativity without needing relativity. And also this can yield the prediction of the perihelion of Mercury and everything that relativity can solve, classic physics can solve now that we have these reformulated equations. And here are some examples of these equations. Again, you can review the document and get these later. Let's see, I want to get to the first page, second page. So gravity does not affect light. On the left is what relativity and Eddington say we should see, but on the right is what both Eddington and his second team in Brazil actually observed on May 29th, 1919. Refraction only at the solar limb. So relativity has all of these equations to describe how gravity should bend light at a given distance away from a body. And they have a different equation for each distance away from the star. It should bend this much. If this much further, it should bend less and less. But only one of those equations is correct. The one describing light bending only at the meniscus, the boundary, and at the plasma solar limb. All of these computer simulations are based on the other equations. And if it works out in their simulations, they think that it must work out in reality. But light does not bend in the corona or in the vacuum of space. It only deflects through refraction, Fermat's law, at the boundary of a star. And that you can verify with every solar eclipse event where the stars seem to change position only at that boundary, but there's no distortion of the stars. Like how a straw bends at the meniscus of water, The straw doesn't progressively bend more and more according to the inverse square as it approaches the meniscus. It bends only at the boundary. Well, that is a major difference. Even though gravity drops off according to the inverse square, light does not bend according to the inverse square as relativity predicts it should. So we have mathematics versus mathemagic. We have what is calculated versus what is measured. We have what's predicted on the left, what's observed on the right, what should be, but what actually is. The fourth dimension versus the third dimension, Lorentz versus Galilean, and relativity versus reality. On the left, we see distorted space geometry with a planet or another star passing behind a black hole. They say we should see this stretched light, which should deform around the black hole as the star passes by it. But at the Max Planck Institute, over the course of 14 years in time-resolved images, this is what we actually see on the right. There is no distortion at all, and the stars are seeming to orbit a body, but nobody can see what the body is. So they have these simulations and the assumptions on the left, what we should see, but we see what is actually observed on the right via the Max Planck Institute. No distortion, no black hole. Something there to create that gravitational effect that is maintaining the orbit of those bodies, yet there's nothing there. So without dark matter, how would that be explained? Well, Dr. Dowdye's explanation says that it would be the emissions of gravity from a body that had already expired. We can't see the body anymore because it's already gone, but we are still seeing the gravitational influence that has already left that body, still maintaining the orbits of those ones that have not received the back end of that packet yet to destroy those orbits. So one of them deals with assumptions and mathemagic. The other one deals with what's actually observed in mathematics of reality. And again, here is another video featuring Dr. Edward Dowdye, refraction of stars, relativity versus observations and data. And here are some more equations to deal with the angle of incident of incoming radiation, from microwave, pulsar, quasar, visible light, and the deflection of that given the radius of curvature of a body and its mass. Then it has to do more with the radius of curvature more than the mass, unlike relativity. And this is provided by Dr. Dowdye. He said, as his mom used to say, a picture's worth 1,000 words. So this is some of the actual data collected from the satellites that he helped build with and for NASA to collect these pieces of data. And there is a minimum energy path with the light deflecting only within the plasma atmosphere, no lensing or deflection observed in the corona or above in the vacuum. And he says the scientists who support relativity are either unaware of this phenomenon or they don't want you to know about it. This is bad news for them. According to relativity, light bending should be everywhere you have gravitation. If gravitation exists around an object that does not have plasma, the light should still bend according to relativity, but this does not happen. And you can find more about this in his book, Extinction Shift Principle, where he gives an alternative framework under these Galilean transformations. So gravity doesn't bend light, neither does magnetism. Yet you can plainly see the light bending here in the Crookes tube, right? No, it's an illusion of observation. You see the path of charged particles being traced, and the magnetic field changes the path of the glowing particles. The particles flow in an arc due to the deflection of the magnetic field, but it's not the light that bends. Light does not bend ever. It is re-emitted at a tangent and at a constant. So that minimum energy path and least time path, according to Fermat, describes this. No need for fourth dimensions. And the alleged bending of light is only indirect. It has nothing to do with magnetism actually bending the light. And if you were to have a laser pointer, the magnet would not have any effect on the photons. So that the particles, charged particles, are emitting photons, and those particles are affected by the magnetic field, serving the illusion that the magnetism bends the light. And here is Gauss's law of gravitation, where the same radius of curvature deflects light the same, regardless of the mass or density. So if you have a planet of a given size and it's super dense, but you have a less dense planet of the same size, the light will still deflect the exact same around those two bodies, even though they are different densities, because they have the same radius of curvature in that Gaussian surface. And that is the only place where the light deflects, is at the boundary of that Gaussian surface. So finally, what is gravity? According to this particular theory, gravity is an emission propagating at sea. Gravity is a force. Gravity is emitted, absorbed, and re-emitted by electrons. Gravity is the result from high energy particles' constant rate of change at a constant. So you can have Brownian motion at a constant rate of change randomly, but gravity is more the result of a high energy particle constant rate of change at a constant with coherence. So there's a ratio of coherence to incoherence and a rate of change of accelerating and decelerating potentials and gradients, like undulations of fields with elastic and inelastic collisions of particles. The same light and the same gravity does not propagate from the sun and affect us on Earth. By the time it reaches us, the primaries are absorbed by the electrons making up Earth and the atmosphere, and then they are re-emitted by the Earth itself and the atmosphere, and then subsequently re-emitted by the electrons making up you. Any photons in the visible spectrum produce the property of illumination. Any gravitons within a certain spectral range will produce the property and illusion of attraction. The more atoms equal more electrons, which give a false impression that the mass itself is the cause. Electrons are electric in nature, electrostatic potential with a gradient, not orbiting ball particles. That model was outdated by the 1950s and replaced with an electron cloud of probability with a gradient instead. So electrons are electric, and the light emitted by electrons is neutral. So light isn't electric, and neither is gravity. Gravity is not electric, yet the high voltage discharge of exotic craft, UAPs and UFOs, serve the illusion that the gravity itself is electric. It is not. There is no direct link between gravitation and electromagnetism, only indirect. Thus, the futile search for a theory of everything, or a unification of mutually exclusive concepts with opposing mathematical frameworks. I love the electric universe theory, but sorry, it's not electric. Universe is electric, but not gravity. So here we deal with pressure, coherence, and atomic feng shui, I call it, just order on the atomic scale. And I think these are some fundamentals that will lead to emissions of gravity and exotic effects that are mimicking and simulating a high pressure state. And generating a high pressure state is extreme order and coherence, generates extreme rotation and velocities, extreme voltage superconductivity, extreme pulses like femto lasers, and rates of change at a constant, and asymmetric absorption to dissipation of electrons. So here I have an example of Dr. Pierre-Marie Robitaille's liquid metallic hydrogen solar model. In his model, the hydrogen, which is normally a gas, compresses so much from so much pressure that it forms a condensed matter lattice like that of graphene, a hexagonal chain link lattice structure that is in convection like a liquid metal. So when you have extreme pressures, things normally separate evenly. You have coherence, you have exotic effects. And if you consciously engineer things like nanotechnology and super cold, super fast rotations, you can reap the benefits as if those things are in a high pressure state. So a superconductive overload and a rate of change of mass help to generate these exotic effects and emissions of gravity. Accumulating electrons around the same mass will result in exotic behavior. A meltdown is a loss of electrons, but an overload is an excess of electrons, which exceed the amount of mass that can contain it. which requires a certain density of mass to dictate a given overload point, which has asymmetric absorption and emission, which I'll show in this video in a moment. So absorption of kinetic energy in 3 orthogonal axes, but output restricted to only 2 orthogonal axes. So there's an entire dimension of kinetic energy assisting the other 2 axes with radial and planar emissions. The same energy is present, but not in Brownian motion, but more focused and coherent, like a laser. With photon-like characteristics, the energy can pass through insulators. Rather, it's not the same energy, it's re-emitting through the insulator. So there's no quantum tunneling in this particular theory. There's only re-emissions at a constant which serve the illusion of tunneling. And here I want to show an example of this. Atoms and their constituents evenly separate under pressure, which is an aspect of coherence, an important concept in physics. Hold on a second. All right, there we go. So John Searle was talking about this stuff with the random energy in 3 dimensions and the coherent energy in 2 dimensions. We're zooming into some metal and zooming in all the way to those so-called electrons on the quantum scale. Now, the people walking around are the parts and constituents of the atoms. All of that energy is normally incoherent. Oh, sorry about that. Let's go back to that. Any traffic action. Energy flowing one way and different directions. All of that energy is normally incoherent in Brownian motion, clashing around all at random. All those people going their own way in different directions and different speeds, but that it's in 3 dimensions on multiple floors. Just want you to get an idea of random and chaotic energy flowing, like static. Again, in 3 dimensions on multiple floors throughout an entire skyscraper. But now, instead of everyone just wandering around on their own like static, visualize the people marching together, all in the same direction towards an exit. All of those so-called electrons in motion. This would be like an electric current. Now you have people bumping around like a raging rapid, but at least in a common direction. Every person, every electron trying to make their way to the exit, and on every floor of the skyscraper. Normally, if a person walks in the building, then the person will eventually come out. So there is an even flow of in to out, pretty symmetric without any traffic jams. But now, instead of all the people entering and exiting through the front doors at the ground floor, imagine there's a bridge between 2 buildings, and only on 1 floor, right at the middle of the building. So now you have 3 dimensions worth of people on multiple floors trying to get to 1 bridge on 1 floor. That creates a lot of pressure and a lot of bottlenecking, translating that 3 dimensions worth of energy into 2 dimensions. The same amount of people are present, but now restricted to flow on 1 floor, on 1 plane. Now we're going to add another layer of complexity. Not just moving around the existing electrons that make up the building, but we're going to add more people and more energy to the system from the surrounding environment, adding more energy and load. More input equals more people joining the action. So imagine fleets of helicopters dropping people off on the roof. And in addition to people rushing the rooftops, there are also bursting through the front doors like Black Friday, bottlenecking that energy. All those multiple floors worth of people heading towards those bridges and spokes. People are going to be forced together even though they want their own space and want to repel. But more load means more pressure. Okay. So that's just to give you an idea of the compression or accumulation of energy rather than the positive matter. And this is an analogy to negative mass. Negative mass is not real, but we can interpret the scenario as if it is real. And here on the right is an article on Science Daily of negative mass and high speed, how electrons go their own ways. And as an analogy again, on the left here, this is from Smarter Every Day, Destin. And he has a pendulum hanging in his car. And as he accelerates, the pendulum goes back as normal. So the mass goes in opposite to the acceleration. But here he has a helium balloon. So he accelerates forward, and the helium balloon accelerates forward on the same direction, because the amount of air is heavier than the helium balloon. So the air sloshes back, pushing the lighter stuff forward, as if the lighter stuff is behaving like negative mass. So you can equate that scenario mathematically as negative math, and you can interpret it as such, even though it's not real. The scenario is behaving as if. So with an accumulation of electrons, it can behave as if negative mass is present, and the surrounding environment will act on it and do the work and repel it from the ground. So this is analogous to an impurity in a volume of water rising to the surface from a collection of nanobubbles. So the lifting effect is not ion wind. So here's an analogy. A nanobubble has zero buoyancy because it is so small. There's electrostatic bonding and adsorption, not absorption, like soaking a sponge, but adsorption, where a gas forms a film around a solid object. So you have a film of gases or a film of stuff accumulating around the conductor, which changes its buoyancy in the water. So you have a bunch of nasty impurities in the water. You inject some nanobubbles in the water. The nanobubbles will seek out the impurity and start to latch onto the impurities. And with enough bubbles latching onto it, it changes the buoyancy of the impurity, and the impurity rises to the surface. That's the analogy. So it's from all the bubbles sticking to it. But in this case, it would be from the accumulation of a negative charge in a negative state, which then the surrounding positive state would push it away. So this opposites attract in polarity, but opposites repel when it comes to states. So the potential of that helium balloon wants to rise to equalize its potential, because the rest of the surrounding environment is pushing it away. So the balloon does no work. The impurity does no work. The UAP does no work. It's the surrounding environment that repels it and pushes it up. So the nothing is really attracted to the surface, but rather it's pushed upwards. But you can interpret it as it being pulled up. So it's the surrounding environment that acts on a craft or an overloaded system as an open system. Something is depleting to generate that exotic effect, according to the first law of thermodynamics, but you have such an accumulation of this excess of energy that it is quite exotic, and it behaves opposite to what we are used to, just as John Searle used to say. And he called it inverse gravity rather than anti-gravity. But I don't think either of those are accurate, because anti refers to the cancellation of, and inverse refers to a flipping of, like polarity. But I think it is more involved than that, more of like an absorption and re-emission of, rather than a cancellation or a flipping. So this is, again, not, electrons are not ball particles or bubbles. This is just an analogy for the lifting effect, like the Meissner effect or the actual lifting. Oh, and another thing to mention, that if a craft were to use this type of technology in space, that all space dust would just move out of the way. Anything with less mass than the source would be pushed away. But if you were to encounter like an asteroid or something with more mass than the ship you're in, you would move out of the asteroid's way. So if something has less mass, it would move out of your way. If something has more mass, you move out of its way. And if you're underwater, the water will move out of your way. So you can, it would be as if you are flying in space, but underwater. So you could travel through the oceans and stuff, and it would be like you're flying underwater, because everything would push out of your way. And in this particular model, mass remains constant under Galilean electrodynamics. So when a cooled magnet levitates over a cooled superconductor through the Meissner effect and flux pinning, we don't say that the magnet or superconductor lost its mass or lost its weight or fluctuated its mass, and then it gained its mass again once it heated up and then came back down. That's not gravity. We say the magnet or superconductor was repelled upwards with all of its mass, then all of its weight. Levitation does not equal mass fluctuating, even though, again, you can write an equivalent mathematical proof to suggest that mass fluctuates. It does not. So here is provided by Dr. Edward Dowdye on the right, the perihelion of Mercury alternative under Galiliean transformations to show that mass does not fluctuate, nor is not needed. And it's just a different interpretation of the same scenarios. Which brings us to the fallacy of warp drive. Okay, if there is no media, there's no fourth dimension, there's no ether, then there's nothing to warp. And that's the fallacy. It's because relativity and all of these other models suggest that there is a light speed limit. And in order to exceed that, you have to warp the fabric of reality and space and time itself. That's not the case. If there's nothing to warp, you can travel billions of times faster with nothing preventing you other than the energy that you have to provide for your own means of travel. So the one reality that we all live in is objective. And if you're traveling millions of times faster than the speed of light, you're simply going to arrive at your location faster. Not that you will experience reality faster or have time difference. So mass does not increase with velocity. And here are some alternative equations to yield the same predictions and solutions as the scenario. And what the illusion is in a particle accelerator, they have a closed chamber and they have containment particles in that chamber cycling. The more that they ramp up their power, the more resistance is put on those particles, which they assume the particles are increasing mass. They can't just look into the chamber and see the atoms. So they're assuming, since it's harder to ramp them up in speed, that they must be gaining mass. And I use the analogy like waving your hand underwater. You have a vacuum, but you don't realize there's a vacuum. So you're waving your hand rather than thinking that it's a thicker media. You're saying that your hand is increasing in mass. No, it's the walls of the containment themselves that are re-emitting the potentials, which are creating resistance on the particles contained therein, serving the illusion that they're increasing mass. And the mass increase is said to only take effect at 0.9% the speed of light anyway, which has never been achieved outside of a particle accelerator chamber. So it's just illusions that they are attributing to the open cosmos in their closed chamber scenario. So the mass is effective. It's an as if it increases, but it's not literal. And this brings us to the most difficult part of the presentation, the concept of time. And do you think time is relative? Relativity says it is relative. That's the whole point, that reality is subjective, that everything Hubble has imaged is in the past, equal to the distance light travels, that these are relativity and ether theories, because relativity was born from the 3D ether, that these abide by Lorentz transformations, that time is connected to light and gravity and distance and size and acceleration, and that a photon itself is a packet of reality, and that suns and stars broadcast reality, and that it replays like the frames of a Hollywood movie in the order by which photons hit you, and that there's space-time, and that you shift in the same frame of reference in space-time, and that we all have our own subjective realities. But according to classic physics, reality is objective. Everything Hubble has imaged is in real time. Galilean transformations, time is completely independent of light, gravity, distance, size, and acceleration. A photon is a spherical massless emission that simply illuminates reality as it is in real time. Time is a universal constant in the one reality we all share. And rather than space-time, we have real time. The velocity of light shifts in different frames of reference, and time is a constant in all frames of reference. So this is the hardest concept that I've had conversations with people for years now. And once you have ongoing conversations, people start to finally visualize the difference in the models. And you are capable of thinking about this stuff in the opposing framework. It is completely different than relativity. So you can't say it is wrong or it's right compared to something else. You have to look at it unto itself. So relativity says the velocity of light is the same to everyone, but it's the opposite in classic physics. So what if it is the same? What if time is the same to everybody? Well, what would that say about atomic clocks? Because plainly a clock on the in space will tick at a different rate than one at sea level. But like how the moon affects the tides of the Earth, the moon also affects the electron configuration around cesium atoms and around atoms in general. So they will deform, and which will act as a lengthening of their tick rate. So in a different strength of gravity, clocks will tick a different rate. And Einstein said, let's judge time by what clocks measure. So if two clocks are measuring something different, Einstein said that we must be experiencing reality subjectively relative to those 2 points. No, it's just that the clocks are experiencing a different tick rate within the one reality that we all share. So there is no time dilation. There is a illusion of radial displacement, which they judge the rate of decay of cesium atoms. That would be like picking 2 apples from the same tree, putting one apple in the freezer for 30 days and one in the sun for 30 days. One of them decomposes faster than the other. So you say the brother apple has a twin paradox and aged at a faster rate. No, it just decomposed at a faster rate, not that it experienced reality at a faster rate. So there's major differences to explain the seeming paradoxes of time, when really it's just an illusion having to do with the tick rates and decay. So Einstein's thought the velocity of light was the same to everyone no matter what, while time shifts, but it's the exact opposite. Time is the same to everyone no matter what, while the velocity of light shifts. So if a star is 1 year away from you and the star puts out its first light, it will take 1 year before you see a flash of light. And then you will observe that star in real time from then on. Not that you will observe the star 1 year in the past. It will simply take 1 year before the properties of illumination allow you to see the source in real time. Not that you'll see back in time equal to the distance it takes light to travel. We're looking at the sun right now, not 8.33 minutes in the past. We're not looking at galaxies in the past. We're looking at them right now. So a photon is not a packet of reality that unfolds like the frames of a Hollywood movie. Time is the same. And everything we've ever seen in the cosmos is happening right now. The history of a volcanic explosion is not contained within the shock wave it produces. There's simply a delay in the time it takes the shock wave to propagate a farther distance. You see the explosion in real time, or you don't. But you don't feel the effects until the time it takes sound to reach you at the speed of sound, about 720 miles an hour. So there's a delay in that wavefront. So imagine a spherical packet of gravity or light emitted by a star. The history of reality is not contained within the light emitted by a source. There's simply a delay in the time it takes the boundary of that wave packet to reach you. You either see the event in real time, you see a star explode, or you don't. But you won't feel those gravitational effects or receive a transmission or a wow signal for millennia. And you won't observe the boundary of that wave packet as a flash until the time it takes light to reach you at the rate of c. There's a delay in the wavefront, but the light and emissions are not a recording of reality. So if a source is accelerating towards you, the emissions that it first gives off will have a delay compared to the emissions that it's giving later on in its journey. So you might get the mid part of the message or the transmission before you get the initial part if the source is accelerating towards you, because the emissions are traveling relative to the source and the initial emissions are traveling at a given rate It's simple, right? Yeah, right. Right. To help to detail this stuff, I wrote another article, very detailed, twin paradox fallacy, time misconceptions, and faster than light communication. So in this, I have some proposed tests that can be conducted once we establish on Mars and or establish some base or space station in between Mars and Earth, or a series of them. We have to be far enough away for there to be a discrepancy between the transmissions we see and what we look at in a telescope. So if we were looking at somebody leaving Mars through a telescope, you were watching them the entire time leaving Earth and traveling there for however many months, you'll still view them in real time the entire time. There will not be a delay of reality by 3.3 minutes, 3.03 minutes. You're just going to see them in real time. But the farther that they go, the more it will look like a bad subtitled movie. So we will see them happen, whatever they're doing in real time on Mars, if we were able to, witness them, that would require like a 22-mile diameter telescope on Earth to look at somebody on Mars. But if we had that, you would see somebody doing their thing on Mars, sending a transmission, you'd see their lips moving, and then you'd see them doing their thing, and then 3 minutes later, you'd get their transmission offset. But you're still in the same reality. So it's just a delay in the transmission, no delay in reality. And when we are far enough from Earth, we will be able to have that discrepancy, which relativity cannot reconcile. And here are some more examples where you can have a laser pointer and the beam taking a specific amount of time from a source and how fast it's traveling relative to an observer. And there are other scenarios that we could have where if a laser pointer is pointed at two observers back to back and they're relative to the observers, you push those buttons, each observer will see a flash of light at the same time. They're not going to look back in time and see the laser pointer initially turn on, but they'll just see a flash of light after a certain time. And if one laser pointer is stationary and another is heading towards and approaching the one observer, yet they both push the button at the same distance, one observer will see a flash of light before the other because that particular light is traveling faster than the other. So it's not constant in all frames of reference. Light has references to each source, and the entire theory of relativity is based upon that not being true. So if that's actually true, then boy, we got to go back to the drawing board. So whatever you're looking at through a telescope and line sight is happening in real time, regardless of distance. So if you were looking at someone on Mars, again, it would take a huge telescope. You would see what they're doing in real time. You'd see their lips moving, but you wouldn't receive the signal. If you had semaphore flags and you were looking through a telescope, you'd be looking in real time, and somebody could wave those flags faster than the transmission sent. Or they can just hold up a yes or no sign on Mars, and you could see that on Mars before their yes or no would actually transmit by a radio signal. So you could see it in real time, but their yes or no would take 3 minutes to be heard. So bringing towards the end of this, meaningful quotes regarding scientific dogma and how we should probably take a look at alternative models for what they are and put all of the information on the table for people to sort through for themselves. And as Dr. Pierre-Marie Robitaille says, physics has become so confident in their model now that nature itself has to be changed in order to allow their models to survive. So if you find that something is a fact, like Leonardo da Vinci says, if you find something in your own experience that contradicts authority, just go with your heart and your intuition and keep pursuing, especially if there's mathematical justification to support your stance. And this leads to, again, the differences between indoctrination and propaganda and education. And I encourage people to visit truefacts.org, and you can see these comparisons. And brings us, before I get to the references, I want to talk about the fallacy of peer reviews. Now, peer review simply means that a claim or a study is made public for scrutiny. not that it must pass some council or board members or hierarchy to be deemed valid. Science is not a consensus. The majority of the scientific community does not and cannot decide upon a correct theory. A true scientist should only seek to know the truth, which corresponds with the laws of nature. And not everyone is your peer. Referees are supposed to be impartial to a given approach, not act as a gatekeeper. So those who dogmatically subscribe to Lorentz transformations and have blinders on, or who filter all their critical thinking through that particular model, those people cannot act as a peer to review the mutually exclusive mathematical approach of Galilean transformations, which again happened to yield the equivalent solutions. How could you be mad if it arrives at the same solutions? You know, you're going to refuse to peer review it? It's crazy. So there can be no Lorentz transformations in the framework of Euclidean space geometry. And likewise, there can be no Galilean transformations of velocities outside the framework of Euclidean space in a fourth dimension. The fundamental principle of straight-lined path and rectilinear motion of photon and graviton, and the re-emission in different frames of reference is not taught in modern physics. Everything is treated as the same packets that distort, and gravity is the space curvature. But what if it's not? So for those who can look at the universe from this opposing framework, you're free thinkers. And here are some references, publications, corroborating citations and peer reviews that you can look through later. And I'm not sure if you can click on the links. I have a PDF version of this presentation so people can follow along and look at it later. But there's lots and lots of information by very high-level, credible astrophysicists and electrical engineers, mathematicians, and the scientific community who is questioning the status quo. Here are some more links for Dr. Edward Dowdye's work, which again, I'll provide if you can't click on those. Oh, and his book to the right, the mathematical illustrations pertaining to the extinction shift principle. This is all extinctionshift.com and his extinction shift principle. A primary is extinct, becomes extinct, is extinguished, and a secondary is re-emitted. So to all of those who believe that science is a consensus or who think that the science is settled, I present you with Galileo's preserved middle finger. We got relativity, reality on the right or on the left, and then how relativity says reality works. And this is the difference between the Jensens and the Flintstones, folks. This is the exotic technology versus rockets and batteries. So if we can get some people to pay attention to this stuff and help fund these exotic approaches, I think we can travel the stars within a generation. It'll take just as much work as CERN or NASA or SpaceX. But if we have a different focus, we can do a lot more than what we're doing now. Well, here's an example of Professor John Searle from 2004 and the alleged Higgs field, which was presented in 2012. And John Searle was talking about all of this stuff for decades. And I could go a lot more into how his technology directly relates. If you notice that he has extreme order, he has extreme rotation, he has extreme pulses, he has superconductivity, and all of the fundamentals as if it is mimicking a high pressure state. It abides by all of these factors, and it satisfies all of the electrical engineering requirements of vectors and everything needed. So if there is that much justification, and everything we have done so far in the lab has validated these claims, then why shouldn't we continue to do it on a bigger scale? So I'll leave with this: a genius versus wisdom. All it takes to become a genius is to surround oneself with fools. It's better to be a wise man than a genius. A wise man has logic of nature regardless of who surrounds him. A genius can be anyone who the masses hoist onto an infallible pedestal, or one who has merely learned to eloquently parrot the reasoning of others. So it's no doubt that Einstein was a genius, but Dr. Edward Dowdye, he's a wise man. Well, I have this article which goes over all of this material and more E equals the rate of change of MC squared, challenging relativity with Dr. Edward Dowdye. There's a lot more context in the articles and the albums and YouTube channels. And I just want to thank people for considering this heretical information and giving me some time, because this is my life. I plan on doing this for the next 50 years until I die, and then having it chiseled into my tombstone, because I'm dead serious about what I do. For those who recognize the implications and importance, let's see if we can get this stuff funded and make the future generations really happy. Thank you.
Well, Jason, thank you. I cannot thank you enough for presenting this. This was so, I mean, just absolutely remarkable presentation. Incredibly different than what I'm used to thinking. So I'll be open. You lost me. I think you lost a lot of folks, but still, the amount of work and the amount of effort that you put into this was just incredible. Let me do this. Let me stop the screen share for now. And I'm going to put it on gallery view, and everyone please give Jason Verbelli an enormous